Humans are relational beings. We relate from the moment we leave our mother's womb until we leave in a casket or an urn. We are relating to other people. That's what we're self-conscious. We have an individual self that we're aware of, related to all an infinite, like all these other selves. That's what it means to be human. We are relational beings. So all of us have to be psychologists. We have to have some way of coming up with like a theory of how understanding other people's behavior. We have to do that, and we already do it all the time. So everyone is a psychologist.
Welcome to the show. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Luke, and today I'm sitting down with Jamal Maroon. So the topic of today's discussion is going to be personality, and specifically the work that Jamal's been doing around the three human energies and a whole host of things to talk about there. So just a little context. Jamal's an old friend of mine, and he's been doing some really interesting stuff that I'm going to let him elaborate on, but big time researcher, really interesting guy. And so, Jamal, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on and making the time. Maybe we could start just for the audience, give a little bit of your background and kind of the work that you've been up to.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I consider myself a seeker of truth, and that's led me to research and explore what that means for myself and read books. And I think I've always been interested in psychology, understanding what makes us who we are and why we think in certain ways. And yeah, that following that path, especially during COVID, I was very interested in spirituality as well. But I saw, we could say, the shadow side of humanity a lot during COVID, and that made me especially curious of why do we behave the way we do. And yeah, through exploring that, I eventually found my mentor when I took a leap of faith to drop out of college and go to Mexico. And through my mentor, I found this incredible research institute that he has, that I'm a part of. And when I found out about his work, it was a lot about relational dynamics. And approaching that, I was super interested in personal development. You know, I've seen all the self-improvement kind of generic books and a lot of the spiritual books and the meditation and the yoga and all these kinds of things. I felt like I was hitting a bit of a plateau, but I didn't really realize it so much at the time. And when I found my mentor, Chrysalon, as he was introducing me to his work, I started to realize the importance, like there's inner work and then there's relational work. So I was realizing like I can do all the inner work that I want in the world, but at the end of the day, real wealth is actually love. It's a vibration between other people and a form of harmony between other people. And at that point in time, I had to be honest that I didn't have much of that relational harmony. And so that kind of began my passion for relational work. And a part of my mentor's institute and his research is the topic of personality is huge. It's a big part. I say the two main things, practices that we focus on is something called soul mirroring, which you can get into more another time. That was what my first book, The Mirroring Manifesto, is about. And this personality model that we call the three human energies, which we're going to hop into today. So yeah, overall, I'm just a seeker of truth who loves psychology and spirituality.
Yeah, man. I mean, I think you bring up a really good point. There's a lot of focus within, maybe these seeker communities on personal development, which is great. You have to go through that process, but ultimately the end goal is to be a better part of your community and to like use that inner work you've done in order to, live in the world around you and really bring benefit. So that's what gets me really excited about this personality model and the work you've been doing is I think it really encapsulates both. So, maybe we could start just by giving an overview of the three human energies and kind of use that as a jumping off point.
Yeah, absolutely. So to put it simply, the three human energies is a personality model, and it assumes essentially that we have three main faculties. So the intellect for our ability to think, which we call reflection, our heart, our ability to feel, which we call perception, and then our will, our ability to do things, and we call that action. And the general idea is that we have all three, but we differ in our relative proportions of them. So for instance, some people who are stronger in reflection are the kinds of people who obsess over meaning. They're the kind of people who love to ask questions, and they really love to understand the details and like make all the connections between different fields and like all like the like when people drop like facts like the fun facts and mind-blowing kind of thing, like reflects people love like the connect, they need to understand things. The ones that bombard you with the why questions, like, so those are more reflection oriented. And then perception oriented people, their lives revolve around relationships. Everything is about relationships and connecting with other people and having a deep understanding of feeling of belonging. And they're super human oriented. And that's what they don't care about like understanding things so much. And they don't really care about projects and like needing to build things quickly. Like chill, just relax, have fun, be like, so that's more kind of perception type. And then action, they don't care about thinking, about theories. They don't really care so much about like the connections and like talking about their feelings. They just like to get things done. Like they just like to work on projects and like build tangible things. They love achievement. And yeah, so that's kind of a brief idea of the three human energies and the dominance, like what it can be like to be dominant in the different ones. And then from those, six typologies emerge. So the typologies are kind of like archetypes of personality. So many of you might be familiar with the work of Carl Jung and the notion of an archetype. So the idea is that from each of these energies, depending on the order of them, will be a different kind of archetype. So for the reflection, you have the scientist and you have the philosopher. For perception, you have the helper and the artist. And then for action, you have the manager and the leader. So as we get deeper in the conversation, we'll dive more into the types and the three human energies. But generally starting with the three human energies is a great place to start. And yeah, so that's a brief overview of what the personality model is. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that's helpful. And I think, just while you're going through that, some examples come to mind of folks in my life who fit those different molds in one way or another. But before, we dive too deep into the specifics of the different archetypes, I think most people are probably familiar with personality models in one way or another, right? Like, I know for me, I've had to take the Myers-Briggs or one of those personality tests in the past. And then there's things kind of on the other end of the spectrum, like putting an astrological reading in or doing human design, gene keys, these kind of more new age type things. If you could dive into a little bit, what is different about this personality model than maybe some that we're already familiar with, kind of explaining some of those differences and yeah, kind of using that as a jumping off point to understand this a little more.
Yeah, definitely. So, wow. I mean, the topic of personality has always fascinated us for as long as we can remember. And up until around 1878, which was when the first psychological lab was founded by a man named Wundt in Germany. Up until then, personality was always a topic of philosophy. It was never something that people believed that you could really study scientifically. So it was always the philosophers who were in charge of that topic of understanding the psyche, essentially. And the first kinds of psychologists, we could say, were actually astrologers. And pre-Copernican cosmology, it was well understood that one, the psyche is a real thing. So psyche actually comes from the Latin, which means soul. So in the past, the people used to regard the psyche, the soul, as an actual substance, as a very real thing. But now, we don't really realize it because we're just living in these times. But now it's the opposite, where we don't see the psyche as real at all. We see matter as the thing that is the most real, but thousands of years ago, that's not how people saw the world at all. So with that is also the influence of the celestial bodies was something very, very important and well studied, and that became the systems of astrology that miraculously emerged across all the different civilizations. And yeah, so astrology, I really believe, is an actual science. I believe it's a divinatory art. Um, and it's super profound. And yeah, there's many different systems, and I'm not an expert in astrology. I know people who are, and I think it's a super valuable tool for self-knowledge. And this is really what personality models and personality in general is all about, is this whole axiom of know thyself. And it's a tool to understand oneself. And yeah, so astrology, I-ching, even the Kabbalah to an extent, where these were various different ancient tools used to understand ourselves. Um, and then it was around 1878, people started to say, wait, why can't we're studying all these things scientifically. Why can't we study the mind scientifically? Why can't we try to understand that? So they began conducting experiments and this was the evolution of what we can call scientific psychology. But they quickly ran into this problem where it's impossible for me to know, for example, for you, Luke, I don't know what's happening in your mind. It's not possible for me to measure that. And so that I can try to interview and get things. So they kind of hit a wall where they're like, we can't really study the mind. We can't really know what's happening there. And then this is when the behaviorist tradition emerged, the split between the behaviorist and then the depth psychologist. So the behaviorist said, we can't study the mind. Therefore, we're not even going to bother going there. We're just going to observe people's behavior and then infer mental processes from that. So they were like, we're not even going to acknowledge any of that stuff. But then the depth psychologists, with most famously started by Sigmund Freud, were like, no, we're going to go there because that's the depth is where our humanity is. And we're going to try to understand it, but we're going to treat our inner experiences, whether they be dreams, whether they be fantasies all these things that happen, we're going to treat that as our empirical data that we're going to use. And then we're going to use the same scientific mindset, but use that in approaching our inner world to understand things. So that's the split off with the depth psychologists and the behaviorists. And that's an important one because most people, when you go to university and you study psychology at any of the universities, it could be Oxford, Harvard, your local state, whatever, they all exclusively teach the behaviorist tradition. And if the only thing they'll tell you is Freud was this crazy dude with this whole Oedipus complex and this incest fan, that's all they tell you. They don't even tell you about all the other brilliant thinkers there. Like and they treat them like they're crazy, unscientific, mystical people because they had the courage, the audacity to approach the psyche, the subjective world with an objective mindset as best as they could. And it doesn't mean they're all right, but where they were wrong, they're helpfully wrong, we could say. Um, so yeah, and then from there, different personalities emerged. So from the behaviorist tradition, one of the ways they approached it was looking at language. So they said, okay, if we use the dictionary as like a database and we kind of catalog all the adjectives ever used to describe humans that we've ever captured, can we like whittle them down to like a list of like a few traits and then we can build a personality model on that? So that was there was like their only way of really approaching it. It's called they based it on trait theory. And that ended up kind of being refined over time. There was like the 16 personality, but then it kind of got refined into what's now known as the Big Five. So have you heard of the Big Five traits
Yeah,
before?
I've heard of it. I don't know. Maybe it might be helpful to go through the five types. I don't think I could name them all.
Yeah, so like the acronym they use is called OCEAN. It's like openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism is like
Hmm.
the five traits. And the idea is like they're each like a gradient, and then you exist on somewhere along that spectrum. And they use kind of a big self-report questionnaire to
Hmm.
kind of help you find which way you're on. So the thing with the Big Five and these kinds of more scientific models, they're super practical and useful in organizational settings. Like if I need to delegate different tasks to different people and like need to know their strengths and weaknesses roughly, it's really helpful to be able to take one of these like surveys that have been, and also it has the most amount of studies by far, like
Hmm.
tens of thousands of longitudinal meta-analysis. Like in terms of like scientific validity, the Big Five, nothing even comes close to it. So for people who are just super, I just need something that just works really quickly in that kind of setting. The Big Five is the best, hands down. and even for clinical, like for some clinical work, if you're, I don't know, a social worker, you're doing counseling, like this kind of, it can be very practical and useful from a practitioner standpoint. But like no one actually who learns it, like in school, for instance, that no one actually remembers and uses that. Not like for the most part. Like, no, I'm like, Luke, I think you're a little low on neuroticism and high on agreeable. Like people don't really use it. Like you only hear like psychologists or like people using it in organizations.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, so there's the ancient models, there's the scientific models, and then more recently, there was a man named Alan Krakauer who goes by Ra Uru Hu, and it was a late 1980s. I'd like to say 1987, and he claimed to have channeled this system that he called human design. And the idea with human design, I mean, many people listening are familiar with human design, and the main idea with that is he claims that the system integrates the Kabbalah, I-ching, astrology, quantum physics as well. I think like genes as well, like genetics as a part. It's a really complex system that is trying to bridge kind of the best of these ancient systems and many different ones, even Vedic philosophy too. So like really trying to bridge all this ancient wisdom with modern scientific breakthroughs into the system. So if you've ever used it, you can put your natal chart information in and it gives you this thing called a body graph. And if you've ever seen it, it's so complicated. It's like there's like 9 energetic centers with like all these numbers. It looks like an electrical like, have you used the human design before?
Yeah, I have used it. It is complicated. And I know it's just with this and with astrology, it's interesting to plug your information into something and be given, some sort of result that tells you about yourself. And I know for both human design and astrology, sure, there's actually some things that I find to be pretty in alignment with how I view myself, but there's other things that maybe you don't so much agree with, and that's kind of the interpretation that I hear from most people who use those systems.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, these are just all tools. Like my goal coming here today to bring, I'm not like mine is the best and like, like trying to have like a dick measuring contest of the personality models. That's not my goal. They're all different tools and they have different uses. And I think they're all helpful. It's all to have knowledge of self and ideally to be able to coordinate and understand each other better. So yeah, that's it's very, yeah, with astrology and human design, that's one of the flaws definitely that I've highlighted in my works, that it's super complex, super, super complex at to a level where to actually understand it, you have to commit to years of study. Like especially astrology, you have to do a PhD level of research to really understand all 12 zodiac signs and how the positions in different each classical planet in the different, like it's advanced stuff. Like we're talking it's the equivalent of you want to like learn how to play an orchestra and like be at the, like you need to really know your musicianship has to be off the charts. So I would apply that also to human design to a degree. Is like this is a very complex system, and with that as a from a practical standpoint, like okay, I want to use this. You get the chart back, you can do a bit to understand it yourself. Okay, I'm a manifestor generator, or okay, my sun sign is Leo, or you can kind of like use it to get an but when you want to go further, you have to rely on an expert to kind of tell you more often than not quite definitive statements about who you are, and that can be a bit of dangerous territory. And that's why the people kind of prefer the more scientific models of like at least we don't have to rely blindly on some authority. At
Mhm.
least we have some kind of tool that gives us that mental safety that we don't get from an astrology or human design.
Yeah, it's kind of like opposite ends of the spectrum there. With Big Five, you're taking a questionnaire, so you're at least like provided some real world examples, like, hey, how would I respond in this situation, etc. It's been a while since I've taken one, but I do remember it being like pretty ambiguous at times. You really like a couple other questions, you're just like, I don't really know. I'm just going to put down XYZ thing, and who knows what kind of impact that has on the result. And But I have a question, I guess, for any of these models, but particularly astrology and human design. Like, is there room for like the dynamic nature of human development within these models? Because that was one of the things that really stuck out to me about the three human energies and just using kind of that triangle model there and how you have it broken out on your site, right? It definitely makes sense to me based on, where the stars were when you're born, or some set of conditions that we probably don't have the capacity to fully understand. We obviously come into life with some set of um, I guess settings, right? Preconceived settings that make up who your base personality is. And that changes over time due to a variety of settings. But there's taking the triangle as an example, right? There's one side that's going to start off a little longer than others. And you can even see that in children, right? They're not a perfectly balanced set of heart, intellect, will. Some children lean more towards one thing and the other. And I think that's, what's really well described in this model is how by highlighting certain areas that maybe we have a deficiency in, you can work on that. And the goal is to make that triangle as balanced as possible. Is there something along those lines within those other models where they take into account, like, hey, if you have, if you're for taking the big five, if you have a lot of neuroticism, right? Like, there's ways to work on that. Or what about in astrology and human design?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know the other models how exactly they answer this as well, but I can say quite confidently that they're not as dynamic. Like for instance, there is a degree of dynamism. Like for instance, a lot of astrologers say the phrase like the stars align you, they don't define you.
Hmm.
So they do kind of there is a notion of giving room of like this is kind of like your character. Like imagine you're playing a video game, like I don't know, like a Super Smash Bros. Or Mario Kart or something,
Yeah.
and you have like the different strengths and weaknesses relatively. The idea is like when you get a chart from whether it be human design or astrology, is kind of defining that for you, which is fun. It's like, oh my God, I guess I'm Donkey Kong. I thought it was Mario, kind of thing. So that's cool. But like, yeah, it doesn't actually capture the dynamic of like, well, how do you change over time? It
Hmm.
doesn't really give much room for that. In astrology and human design, it's usually based on the philosophy of reincarnation. So it's like this is you're kind of locked into this for your life. But hey, next life you can do a new character kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, with the more scientific models, yeah, the way the questionnaires are designed, it depends which ones you take. So they have like the model, but then there's many different kinds of questionnaires, and yeah, it does kind of put you in also a certain kind of category, and it doesn't really change that much over time.
Hmm.
Based on, and that's part of the validity of it. That's part of what they use as an argument for the validity of it. Hey, people retake it. It's called the test retest
Hmm.
validity. When people take it 5 years later, they still get really close results. Hence, this is actually quite accurate kind of thing. But yeah, so what one of the elements of the three human energies that differentiates it from this is when you identify, for instance, that you're reflection dominant, that means necessarily you have to be weaker in one of the other ones. Like that means that you're seeing the world through a particular tint and that other people are seeing something else. So it actually opens up and encourages that personal development of like, oh, this other person's seeing it completely differently. And
Hmm.
it facilitates the desire to want to, how do they see things that I don't quite see it as much? And it encourages that growth in that other area. Whereas these other models, it kind of like gives you that character analysis. Here, you're Donkey Kong, but it doesn't really say like, here's what you Mario is really good at that you're not, that you
Hmm.
can specifically develop in yourself. So I call this problem the like divisive labeling or the divisive classification of types, which is essentially like, okay, Luke, you're X type and I'm Y type. And X and Y types are different, and X and Y types don't get along. If we make that as like which a lot of these, or like we get along on some things, but we don't get along on these kinds of things.
Hmm.
When we do that, it allows for discernment, which is nice. It's like, okay, so, oh, okay, you kind of play those roles and explore what that might mean in our dynamic. But then at the end of the day, I'm identified as Y, you're identified as X, and we're always going to be like kind of, well, he's different. But with this model, we all have all three, and we have all six types. So
Mhm.
let's say, for instance, I'm very strong in philosophy. It'll become even increasingly clear too. I'm really strong in philosopher. The opposite is manager.
Mhm.
But if it was another type, if I when I come across managers, people are very strong in manager, I get a lot of triggers. I get a lot of relational, emotional triggers. And in the other types, it can facilitate like a laziness in inner work. Because when I get triggered, then I can just say, oh, it's just because you're a manager,
Mhm.
kind of just like bat an eye at it. But now it's like, no, you have excellence as a manager in an area that I'm not as good at. I'm weaker in that. So actually, I can use these kind of triggers and conflicts to question, how can I better integrate my inner manager? So it kind of it breeds a feeling like a philosophy of personal responsibility more so than the other models because of that dynamism. At least that's what I'd argue.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it really came across that way in the book. And, I don't want to like dig at astrology. I think a lot of maybe the criticisms, at least coming from my end, are of like the mainstream use of astrology, where people really don't understand like the deeper intricacies. But one example that just came to mind is like you have someone who's, say, like a Leo, and they're like, oh, I don't get along with the Scorpio at all. Like, I just can't deal with them. Like, they have Scorpio energy or something along those lines. And yeah, it's just writing a person off, one who maybe like sees the world a different way than you, but there's no like call to action as far as like, hey, here's actually how you can come together really well with that person. You can balance your energies and work towards something, creating something, make this relationship work. A lot of times people just write it off as, a loss, or I can't work with these people. And I just think that's probably a net negative for sure. So that's one of the really, I think, interesting things in talking about relational dynamics and using this model. So maybe we could segue a little bit into that and how you see this working functionally for like increasing collaboration within communities, businesses, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. There's a different, like when people hear astrology, they've only come in contact with pop astrology,
Yeah.
like this, like horoscope and all this kind of stuff. And so it makes sense why they put it on such a low level and pedestal. They don't know the deep, like initiatic science of it. So they kind of base it on that. So I'm glad that you brought that point up. Like I'm not here to be in that same camp of like, you're an astrologer, oh, you're crazy, like, horoscope kind of person. Like, no, I understand. But anyway, so, oh, forgive me. The question again was on the organization. Okay, yeah, I'm
Yeah,
talking about
real quick,
organization.
actually, before you jump into that, I want to just touch on one last point kind of between the major differences here that we've spoken about. And again, like with astrology, it is so complicated. So unless you're willing to go spend however many years, I don't know, 8, 10, 20 years learning this, you're always having to work through an interpreter, right? And so you're relying on someone else's interpretation. And like you said, you're never going to understand someone, even if you question them for 2 months, you're not going to know them as well as they know themselves. And that's something that I really like about, this model, or even Jung's archetypes, is it requires a level of self-study and really like introspection and doing the work yourself, and then saying like, okay, if I'm honest with myself about XYZ thing, like here's maybe where I see myself. And if you are doing that honestly, I think you're going to come at a much more accurate place than you would even working through a really good teacher who is like, has all the best intentions and wants you to understand yourself. Like there's still that level of disconnection. Whereas if you're doing the work yourself, you're going to get to a closer result, and like it'll ultimately be more valuable. So thought I'd throw that in there for what it's worth. But yeah, let's now shift into the relational dynamics and kind of like how you see this being used practically amongst different groups.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the simplest metaphor that I use in my book in a subchapter called Inner Harmony and Outer Harmony, the simplest way to kind of make sense, and largely just of the value personality models in general, is imagine all of us are instruments, right? And when we're doing inner work, it's like we're practicing our instrument alone. So
Mhm.
it's like imagine I play guitar, maybe you play the flute. And when we're doing inner work, it's like I'm practicing my scales, I'm playing different chords, I'm playing on my own, you're doing the same thing with your flute, right? So we can say that's the kind of inner work side of things. But then the relational work, the outer work, is like, okay, now we have to play in a band. Now we have to play in an orchestra, and we have to coordinate our vibrations with each other to produce harmonious music. So you can make the most amazing music on your own, but you could be awful in the context of a band. You know, like there's a level of like having to coordinate, and anyone who's played like a violin or an instrument in an orchestra knows like when you're not in tune with the rest, it brings down the harmony of the whole group kind of thing. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind with the relationship between the two. It's like you need to practice.
Mhm.
You need to practice and get good at your instrument, and you need to know what instrument you're playing. If you're trying to play the violin like bongos, it's not going to work. You know, like you have to learn. So part of that's the know thyself. And what is your instrument? You have a particular instrument? No, learn what that is. That the model helps you identify that more clearly, so you can improve your practice in that way. And then, okay, now we're here. The model is like it's like a musical scale that we can all kind of use to coordinate between each other to play harmonious music in whatever organizational context that could be. And yeah, so I just want to bring that as a metaphor first to understand like the relationship between the two. As far as how to apply this practically, I think it's good to be honest about who this is for and who this is not. So if you're not someone committed to inner work, then I don't think this, I wouldn't recommend this model to you. You know, this is really for people who are familiar with notions of shadow work, people who are familiar with the basics of personal development and all this kind of stuff. And they need, like, they want the next thing. They want the next, like, I want to reach a new paradigm to help me go further. This is what this is really for, because this is new. To give context, this was developed by my mentor in 2008. And it's based, and also, I didn't mention this before, I should mention this quickly, that it's also based, it's not like we just kind of randomly threw darts in the dark at a certain, when we came up with this notion of the three. So this idea of the Trinity comes from a spiritual teacher named Omraam Mikhail Ivanov, who we both share a love and interest for. And in his first lecture ever in 1937 in Paris, he brought up this notion of the human being composed of a prison of the intellect, the heart, and the will. And this was radical. Like, you can try to find other philosophers. Please let me know if you find them. This was the first philosopher, first spiritual teacher to make that link of the prism in that way. So from that, he kind of developed this notion that we've just mentioned with the intellect, heart, and will being different and different people. So that was the initial kind of nugget that was the seed that my mentor then planted that developed into this personality. So I do want to mention, like, there is a spiritual lineage behind this too. There's not, so that at least helped me at the beginning have a bit more trust of like, we're not just throwing together random stuff. Yeah, so as far as the practicalities of applying an organization, yeah, so the people who are committed to personal development, I think it's also, you want to be committed to like actual conscious relating. So certain organizations, like if you're just doing service, for instance, and you're just like serving food, you're not having like a deep connection with the people. You know what I mean? But like if you're doing coaching, you're doing any kind of like therapeutic healing kind of work with people, or you're running a business, you're doing entrepreneurship where you have a close-knit team and you want to have those deeper connections, then this is super useful. And lastly, for intentional communities, which I really think is a big part of the future, and more people are becoming interested. But time and time again, you see people buy the plot of land. Okay, we got a few hundred acres in Mexico or Costa Rica or whatever. They move there, and the quality of the relationships are so poor. They could have the best land, permaculture, everything, but because they can't understand the personality difference, and even though try nonviolent communication, things like this, and those have their limits as tools, and there needs to be a tool for personality. There has to be one. And something like astrology, how do you expect everyone in the community to know all 12 signs perfectly and be on the same page? That's not going to work. That's not like, how am I supposed to, you're going to have to change how you relate to me, Luke, because my ascendant is Libra. You have to know that. Like, that's not going to work in a
Mercury's in
relationship.
retrograde. We all need to.
Like this, that's not going to, so and that's the same thing with human design.
Mhm.
I would argue, from my understanding of human design, I don't see how people can practically use that for things, for the context like an intentional community, like a conscious business.
Mhm.
How are you going to manage that? Those dynamics between manifestors and projectors and generators and all this kind of stuff, and all the different incarnation cross and all. I don't see it as practical. Maybe other people who are more advanced in this can demonstrate that it is more practical than I'm aware, but from my understanding, no. And the big five is soulless, it's spiritless. It's not, it doesn't actually capture our transcendental element at all, because it comes from the tradition that rejected the psyche as the soul, which is crazy. You're a psychologist. That literally means the student of the soul, and you reject the soul. That's crazy.
Mhm.
But um, so yeah, that's part of why it's very practical. I would argue much more practical in those kinds of contexts.
I've just got to back up the food worker for a second, because even someone like that, right? If, maybe they have a terrible boss who makes their job pretty brutal, and by using something like this, they can understand themselves a little more and understand maybe, the cause of some of those behavioral traits that are giving them trouble, and allow them to work around them in an interesting way. So it obviously becomes more deep the more deep the connections get, but it really can be applied to like any interaction you have in your life, just looking at it through that lens, trying to give pause and just understand that maybe, someone's coming from a place of like way too much intellect, not enough heart. And it's like, okay, I kind of see what's going on here. Let me try to work around this, still being true to myself, but like, just to like that's ultimately how things are going to get better, is just have people have a little bit more understanding when they're interacting with each other, as well as hopefully trying to improve themselves as well and balance things out a little more.
Well, boom, yeah, to hop on that, because I have a really good, important guideline, or actually, I'd say principle for the personality model, and you just highlighted it. So yeah, you're right. Actually, in saying, well, the service worker still, if you're working in food service, like you still need to know personality. Absolutely. In fact, no matter what you do, yeah, we
Hmm.
relate to, from the moment we leave our mother's womb until we leave in a casket or an urn, we are relating to other people. That's what we're self-conscious. We have an individual self that we're aware of, related to all an infinite, like all these other selves. That's what it means to be human. We are relational beings. So with that, all of us have to be psychologists. We have to have some way of coming up with like a theory of how understanding other people's behavior. We have to do that, and we already do it all the time. So everyone is a psychologist. The only difference between who we call psychologists and everyone else is that they just had to formally develop it and
Hmm.
articulate it and write it down. But all of us have implicit theories, we could say, that we don't necessarily state. And a lot of these are just common sense,
Hmm.
right? A lot of what we could say common sense are just implicit psychological theories that everyone kind of agrees on. Um, so I mentioned that because, yeah, that's what excited me so much when I found out about this, was like, hold on, this tool is relevant no matter what area that you're interested in. All of us have to relate to people. We all have a family that we have to relate to. We have friends we have to relate to, all of this. So this is a powerful tool to build those. And then you can change how you communicate to people. This is the fun part. How you can change. And then it's like your level of influence on other people. Not influence in like a manipulative way, but influence in like making them feel deeply understood,
Hmm.
is crazy. I'm using it all the time. It's crazy. That's one of the best things about it. But
Hmm.
yeah, I just want to add that element.
Yeah, that's perfect, man. And yeah, I think now would be a good time. Let's dive into, both the three human energies and then maybe some of the archetypes, because I know there's a lot to go over there. So I'm just gonna let you rip through these. I'll try to jump in if I have any questions. But yeah, this is super interesting. So I'd love to make sure we have enough time to go through all this.
Yeah, absolutely. And then after this, we could also mention a little bit about how to identify where you might be strongest in, because this kind of process of identifying your composition is another big difference in our approach to the psyche as compared to all the other schools of thought. So, but yeah, as far as the types, to hop right into them, I think the way that I've mentioned the reflection, perception, action is already a pretty solid grounding. Just the general notion that reflection is much more the intellect, understanding things, um, and then perception, heart, emotions, feelings, and action, projects, getting things done. So I think from that base, yeah, so the reflection dominant, the two ones are the scientist and the philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
And the scientist, the sacred value of the scientist is discernment. Scientists need to know clearly this is fact and this is not true. They're like really obsessive, like, I need to know that this is 100% true, you know? So, in that sense, they're really concerned with mental safety. What can we know for sure? This is definitely true. Like, this is solid and we can build on this thing. And for them, truth is something that we build up to. It's like, it's the notion that Francis Bacon outlined in his book Novum Organum, which is like the philosophical foundation that led to modern science and the way that we know it, of like, we all have to just collect all of our observations and all of this data, and then from that we build better and better theories and better, and this is the whole process of induction. And this way of approaching the universe, that is very much so, that's like the kind of notion, the kind of archetype of what the scientist is. And also, they really, they obsess over things. They like really, they love to study the universe, but they don't care about people so much. And like the people human world, they like love, they'll go crazy for like a cell, like cellular, like they'll go crazy over this stuff. But like they usually don't apply that same mindset to their wife and kids or their husband, or like that's not, they're like separate, complete, and they're just obsessed. And that kind of explains why in the academic world you see people hyper fixated on really strangely specific topics. It could
Mm.
be like, oh yeah, I'm studying like the cellular anatomy in penguin feet. I'm like, what? You just do that for 10 years? Like, why
I
are you
like
studying?
passion.
Or like, yeah, like, or the chemical composition of pistachios. It's like,
Mm.
what? So like scientists just love, they geek out over all that kind of stuff. Um, and they're more concerned about the micro than the macro. They're much more concerned about the micro.
Mm.
So yes, that's the kind of the energy of the scientist. Then the philosopher on the other hand is
Real quick,
cares.
sorry,
Go
Jamal.
ahead.
Before you jump into the philosopher, I just want to clarify something for the audience is that so we're talking under the umbrella of the intellect portion of the greater triangle, right? So I think that makes sense. Someone with a scientist typology is very large in intellect, but they're maybe lacking in heart or the ability to, kind of communicate with other folks or see the bigger picture there. So I just want to clarify that both the scientist type that we just talked about, as well as the philosopher that you're going to get into, those both fall under the umbrella of the intellect, right? Which is reflection dominant.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. You have reflection dominant, and then also with the scientists in particular, we say that it's reflection dominant,
Hmm.
action secondary, and
Okay.
then weakest dormant in perception.
Yeah.
So they're really bad with relationships. They
Makes
do
total sense.
not value.
I mean, it's just like that makes total sense because if you think about, a really intelligent scientist, they get stuff done. They're like crushing their lab studying penguin feet. But when it comes to, maybe they're a little awkward or they can't hold a great conversation, it's like, yeah, it totally makes sense in the context of kind of that triangle. So I just wanted to clarify that for folks.
No, it's a great point. And I really, yeah, it's important to think about. That's another great thing about this model. Every type, all six types, you can break into the same three components.
Hmm.
That, it seems like a small, like, innovation, like, oh, that makes it simpler. No, that changes the whole game. There's no other model that does that out there. It makes it so simple to like oh, okay, scientists' weakest perception. Oh, that explains why they don't get along with the artist. Like I can see that kind of. So anyway, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So to hop into the philosopher, so the philosopher is reflection, perception, action.
Mhm.
So the philosopher also carries the same love of learning and researching and thinking really deeply and connecting interdisciplinary, notions into new novel ideas and articulating them with clarity and communicate. They love all of that, but they're not concerned about the micro. They believe that truth is eternal. It's unchanging. There are laws that govern the universe, and they're concerned about studying those. They're not concerned about the little details. They could care less about the details. They care about the bigger picture, and they care about moral knowledge. Their sacred value is ethics. And what I mean by that is they're really concerned of, okay, you know these things, but how are we going to relate to each other? You can know all the things you want in the world, but like, how do we discern what is moral and what is immoral? How are
Mhm.
we going to define that? How are we going to get along together? They're concerned about building social systems that work on a big scale. They're concerned about, yeah, and they see truth completely differently. Like this notion of like building it up, they don't see it like that. They see it as eternal laws, and we have to align ourselves better and better to them and study them and articulate them better. So so that's where there's a big clash between the philosopher and scientist. Is their definitions of truth is a huge one that they really clash on, because the philosopher is like, why are you so obsessed with these little details? And then you get into petty arguments with your family and those around you. Do you not see how short-sighted and myopic you are? And the scientists are like, oh my God, look at you, authoritarian, dogmatic, like claiming you know everything. And you're so, and they care a lot about humility. The scientists are like super, we have to be humble and like not claiming. Philosophers come across the scientists as like not humble at all. Like, oh, you think you know everything kind of thing. Um, and then yeah, they're much more sensitive to the relationship world, much more sensitive and more adept at communicating in the sphere of emotions and feelings, but they cannot get things done. They cannot. They really just prefer to just chill and not have to worry about time, about
Mhm.
space, about like I need to eat food, I need to like jobs, and like they don't care. They just leave me alone, dude. Just leave me with my books and let me just write and stuff. Like I don't want to do anything. Like leave me alone. They'd much rather have other people do their ideas for them, like
Mhm.
to actually implement it. So in that sense, the action people look at philosophers like, you guys just sit there and do nothing. Like you guys talk about theories all day. You don't actually do anything. Um, and the scientists, they do more. Like
Mhm.
they get more done than the philosophers in that sense. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of an overview of the scientist and philosopher.
Yeah, the scientist is willing to put on the lab coat and go into the lab every day, but the philosopher is coming in and asking, well, why are we even here? Why do we have this lab? And they're just going to leave and go home and read or write, which, yeah, it makes total sense.
That's a really good image right there. Yeah, that's so yeah. Philosophers are the ones asking the why questions.
Why are we studying penguin feet? What's the implication?
That's such a good way to put it. Yeah. Oh my God. Um, okay, boom. So yeah, that's a good overview of the scientist and philosopher. For perception,
Mhm.
I would start with the helper first. So the helpers are the kinds of people who really care about their sacred value is compassion, like really feeling what other people are feeling, and like not just looking at people as just like machines that just do things. Like no, they have hearts, we have emotions, and we just try to put them aside and pretend like we don't have feelings all the time. And like they are like the kinds of people, like a therapist is like a perfect example of like a helper kind of type of like they really like, so Luke, just tell me what's going on, man. Just I'm here for you, brother. Like they're like they love the safe spaces, you know. Like they really love like, yeah, man, they can just talk about anything. And they love to yeah, they're super yeah, they love to, they're very oriented to other people's lives. which
Mm.
is actually one of their problems, is they're so busy kind of cheerleading for other people that they never get anything done themselves. Like they're so focused, like, yeah, you're the best, like keep going. And then it's like, well, what are you doing? Oh, oh yeah, I forgot to do anything. Like they don't really, they forget to do their own things. And they tend to be very overly generous too.
Mm.
I didn't get into it as deeply, but yeah, all the types have their shadow side, we could say, or like challenges they consistently repeat. And
Mm.
yeah, helpers tend to be very overly generous, like really give way too much of their time to other people, and energy and love to people that they really should have had a bit more discernment on. But they're just so loving and they really care about compassion and like yeah, and they're the ones always defending the feelings of other people. They're definitely big on defending those feelings. But yeah, they like to think a lot, so they really appreciate um being around the kind of feeling and vibration of like good thoughts and like good thinking. And they especially like the philosopher. The helper and philosopher, very interesting synergy. They really like yeah, we can like work together and like with the scientists, they like listening to the scientists, but they kind of miss the bigger picture a little bit. Um and yeah. Oh yeah,
And
but
so,
they can't get anything done. They're weakest in action.
okay, that was going to be my question. So the short side for the helper is action, and then second longest would be intellect, and longest would be perception or will or heart. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so that's another interesting thing. Like you can see in my cover, I have the triangle
Hmm.
of the intellect, heart, and will. But you can also think of it in terms of energies and like a stronger, I call it dominant, secondary, and dormant,
Okay.
you could say. So you can think about it energetically, or you could think about it in terms of like a triangle with like different sides,
Hmm.
whatever you prefer to visualize it as. But yeah, they're weakest in that context. They're dormant action and weaker in the will.
Yeah, I kind of get like a lot of feelings of like traditional motherhood from the helper, right? Like living through their kids and always being so willing to help out that they forget to do things for themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. Actually, that's a big topic that I get into in depth in my book and in my work is the gender polarity of the
Mm.
masculine and feminine, and how I'm introducing this is I start with the feminine. So the helper we'd say is more feminine,
Hmm.
the scientist we'd say more feminine, and the manager the feminine kind of polarity of the three.
Okay.
But that's one from one angle of looking at it. Like we're not saying definitively these are the masculine and feminine types, because my mentor has gone in depth about well, it depends how you look at the model kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so you can definitely associate those more feminine. I say the motherhood when we get into the manager, you'll see the motherhood aspect in the manager a lot too. Um, but yeah, that's a good connection there. So to hop then into the artist, oh wow. Um, the artists are the types who have such intense inner experiences. Like they really feel the visceral like reality of being human on earth like with the most intensity and most saturation, like so intensely, and they can't express it with words. Like it's like so it's beyond even trying to capture with the intellect, and they have to create some other form to make people feel that emotion. And in that way, they're much more connected to the collective in a similar way that the philosopher is more connected to the collective kind of energy, in the sense of they feel like a responsibility, a duty to communicate these feelings that they know everyone else is feeling too, but no one is saying it. Like they care about the authenticity. They really care about like, but you're not actually being yourself. Like they're like the people who rebel, like when people wearing like a stiff like their business suit or whatever, like their stiff thing. The artist's the one that just love to tear it down. Like, who are you really? Like, you know, and part of the meaning and the function of their art is to make people take off their facade, take it off. You know, and their sacred value is freedom.
Hmm.
They want to be free. And they do anything for freedom. They really just want to have their independence, and like they're also the types, perception types we can say, like on the political spectrum, tend to lean a lot more left leaning, more kind of the Marxist communism kind of vibe. They're like, yeah, we need to like in community, like they kind of love that kind of stuff. And but they're not thinking through it so much as much. But but yeah, so the artists care a lot about freedom, and they're very productive. They get a lot of stuff done. They care a lot about achievement in a similar way with scientists. They have a resonance there of like they like to have, I want to be the best in my thing. And they like to have like a powerful discography or work a body of art to demonstrate their greatness in the same way the scientist loves to do that. Whereas like the helper and philosopher are not really, that's not as big of a concern for them. Um, and the other thing with the artists, oh yeah, they're weakest in reflection.
Mm.
They they just like they just throw words around for fun. Like they just kind of throw words around to trigger people. They're like super, they trigger people. They love to like intentionally say things. Like you think about like comedians that are anti-politically correct. Or you think of like, yeah, but yeah, they just love to, yeah, they're very provocative kinds of people are the artists for sure.
Makes sense for sure. I mean, if you think about kind of what art is designed to do in a lot of cases is invoke a reaction from people, whether it's positive or negative. So makes a lot like they don't necessarily need to be right. They just need to get some sort of reaction, generate some sort of buzz, and they're expressing, you know, their feeling however they see fit. They don't want to be constrained by societal norms or anything that. And I think that really like embodies the true artist for me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And another thing to highlight a bit of the shadow of the artist is the number one criticism that they get from other people is that they're really selfish.
Mm,
Like they just care about themselves and their thing and their project. But in the artist world, they're doing the most selfless thing. They're devoting their life to communicating these collective things that we're all going through that we'll never be able to work through unless it's brought to our awareness. Right? It's like the whole principle of like you can't solve a problem unless you're aware of it, where they're the ones bringing the emotional problems of the collective to our faces,
mm,
right? But to do that, they kind of have to go in their cocoon before they become the butterfly. So people are always criticizing them when they're in their cocoon phase of building their project or they're developing their art. And just like, what are you doing? You're just so like, get a job, like be like useful to other people, you know? And that's
mm.
part of their kind of path.
Okay, yeah, that that definitely makes a lot of sense. Let's dive into the will ones. These ones are pretty fun.
Okay, yeah, action types, absolutely, yeah. So start off, you got the manager. And for me, this was the hardest to learn how to articulate, and I had to develop my relationship with it because I have a lot of problems with managers.
Mm,
Like I've as a philosopher, like on the type, this is the book of my mentor, and here's what the personality model actually looks like. I don't know how well you can see it there.
yeah, pretty
Um,
well.
but uh, but yeah, so you can see like the bottom ones, the manager and the leader, that's the red for the action, the yellow for reflection, the scientist and philosopher, and then the helper and the artist, the blue for perception. And then you can kind of see there's a synergy between. So there's a lot of interpretations that we could make of based on the personality model presented here. And also we can talk a lot about gender polarities and the left and right and all that kind of stuff from that. From looking at it visually, which is really, really helpful, especially for people who are more visual kinds of learners. Um, but yeah, on that, sorry, yeah, the philosopher and the manager are opposite. So
Mm,
we say opposite types have the most amount of volatility. They have the most likelihood to run into conflicts. So like the helper and leader and the artist and scientist, like the opposite types really have a lot more volatility. Um, so that's part of why it took me a while to be able to discuss the manager more in depth because I had to do a lot of inner work to like realize because that's what you know it's your weakest type is you're like, why do we have those kinds of people? If you have the reaction like, do we really need them? Like that's what I felt when I first learned about like, managers sound boring? Like, why do we have to have managers? That was a sign that yeah, you've got some false beliefs and things to work through there. um, but yeah. So as far as um, the manager are really sensitive to physical safety. Their sacred value is safety. So in the same way, like the scientist is really concerned about mental safety of like what can we be certain we can rely on mentally. The managers are assessed like how are we going to survive? How are we going to eat? Like they need to have that like that feeling of like so the I think the best way to think about the manager that's helped me a lot is to think about the archetype of the mother
Mm,
and like what the role the mother plays in a family. You know, they love to just have a solid bedrock, a foundation, and knowing that everyone's safe, and they just having that and seeing everyone kind of playing around, doing their own thing within this like safe territory is it's just the most joyful, amazing thing for them. That's all that they want. They're not concerned. They just want to know everyone is safe and they love to take care of these like very practical, tangible needs for people. You know, they'd be happy to just cook and give somebody a meal. You know, they're happy to take a position that's maybe not the most elegant and like most like oh a celebrity kind of thing. They're happy to do that to help other people practically. They're like the most pragmatic, practical people possible, and they're really efficient at getting things done.
mm,
Really, really efficient. They'll figure out a way to get something done if they need to. Um, but they're definitely much more oriented around the physical safety of things. And it's like a caregiver, I think the maternal perspective of it is a very helpful tool. And it's also like kind of like the role of like a police. I know a lot of people have a lot of negative associations with police, but like the notion of like we have to protect what's already been in place.
mhm.
So the kind of like traditionalist in the sense of like we have a solid like rules of how the world and society works, and we need to maintain those. They don't want to hear about new radical ideas like, no, here's the rules, and everyone has to follow these rules. That if we don't follow these rules, we get chaos. So we just need to follow this. And so they're very oriented on the micro in that sense too, because they're just focused on what are we eating today? They don't care about the future. Like, how are we going to survive right now? And they don't care about feelings and emotions. It's like, okay, is that going to help me pay the bills? Okay, then I don't want to talk about that. Like, I need to focus. So they're really oriented on that kind of thing. So that's the yeah. Manager is action, perception, and then they're weakest in reflection.
Mhm.
They are not very good thinkers. We could say, like in the sense of they their level of thinking in terms of how deep they're willing to go is very shallow. They just want to know like the very fundamentals so they can just do it right away. They
Mhm.
don't need to know anything else. Like, yeah, they don't really care about, they don't need to have a deep conversation and no, just like they're happy with a little bit. Um, and they express themselves more through their actions than through words.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up the mother archetype again, in that I hadn't thought about that within the context of manager, but I think it makes a lot of sense given what you said. I think like when a lot of times when people think of a manager, the first thing that comes to mind is a business manager or someone, overseeing a team. And that makes a lot of sense for this archetype as well. Just kind of, what's their role? They're here to steer the boat, keep things on track. Football coach is kind of a similar, um, subtype that could fall under that, where, maybe they're not worried. They're just worried about the next game. They're not worried about the 15-year plan for the football organization or something like that. They're worried about the game they have next week and ensuring that the individual pieces on their team are just going to get the job done rather than necessarily worrying about some of like the deeper intricacies of that.
Yeah, it's a perfect analogy. Oh my God, yeah, with the coach, yeah, and they're super people and person oriented,
Hmm.
very much people
Okay.
and person oriented, which is a great example with the coach kind of idea of like they're thinking about managing people in that sense, and yeah, that's a really good. way of looking at it. Yeah, that's a great way to look. So to move on then to the leader, which we could
Mhm.
say is a bit more of the masculine side of the action.
Okay.
The leader loves to challenge the status quo. Loves the leader is the person who's like very much in touch with like, I just feel intuitively we need to go this way.
Mhm.
But they don't care about the details. Like the manager's like, but how are we gonna do it? Like, how are we gonna fund it? How are we gonna? They're like, I don't care. I just know this is where we have to go. But how do you know? I just know that this is really. So the leader are the ones who like really they kind of guide the spirit, and just people kind of naturally follow them. They just naturally like, yeah, he's going somewhere. Like I don't know where or she like going somewhere, and I feel and they're also the ones who motivate us to like put the fire like yeah you need to go and be like yeah I need to do something. It's like Tony Robbins. It's
Mhm.
like a great example of like when you listen to him you just like start getting fired up like yeah I can't wait to do things. So like the leaders are very much like they kind of when you come into contact with like a leader it makes you think like yeah like I could really do more things. Like I'm kind of getting a little too comfortable. Like I'm complacent. Like, yeah, I need to like achieve something. Like I need to go out and do like they're the motivators. You know what I mean? And yeah, we could say their sacred value is aspiration, or actually we could say courage. Courage is the best way to think. They're all about having you know there's a dragon that we all need to slay. There's something that we all need to confront, and they're the ones that say we're gonna confront that. Like we have to have the faith in ourselves. They're big on the self belief. We have to believe in ourselves and keep pushing through until we achieve this thing. And no matter what obstacles we face, we're gonna grow stronger. And like it's like very much the warrior energy you could say is connected to the leader. And actually yeah so the leader is it's uh action dominant, secondary of reflection, and then weakest perception.
Mhm.
So they also similar to the helper, they really do appreciate like soaking in good ideas and getting a good understanding about how they can move forward better. They kind of take ideas and they move right into like how can I apply this kind of they're soaking in ideas specifically with an intent to apply it right away. Whereas like philosophers and scientists they more like to soak in a bunch of ideas and kind of let it like marinate in their minds and then it'll like manifest into an idea of like leaders have to like to take it in and like boom like right into like putting it into something quickly. um and but yeah, they are really like a bit, we could say emotionally retarded. Like they're so focused on their projects and achievement and all this kind of stuff that they
Mhm.
kind of just tend to bulldoze over other people and not really consider their feelings and emotions at all, which is part of why they're opposite to each other on the model.
Mhm.
It's part of why I mean the leader and the helper.
No,
Because the
right.
helper's like, hey, we need to listen to each other. And the leader's like, no, we need to go there. I
Mhm.
don't care what you feel. Like, so they're really, it can be very brutal emotionally in, in just putting people into action into that. And like, people can get exhausted around leaders. Like, oh my God, does it ever stop? Like, you just work and work and work. Like, oh my God. Um, so yeah, that's a pretty good overview of the six types.
Yeah, and it's like, all of these archetypes are something that we've heard at one point or another, right? Like as you're talking about the leader archetype, the first person that comes to mind is someone like Elon Musk. It's like, yeah, the guy's doing so much different stuff, but just from what we hear in the public, like maybe not so great at the interpersonal dynamics. And so it's like I find all these to be really digestible because it's, even the terms that are used are like pretty easy to understand. I think, one of the big, I guess, aha moments for me is just truly understanding that we do all have part of this in us one way or the other, whether it's the positive side or the shadow side of each of these archetypes, and just kind of using that as a tool to move forward and try to balance out those sides because they all have something to offer, right? Everything that you just went through, there's tons of positives you can pull from all of them. And then, yeah, of course, there's a polarity and a negative that comes with that as well. So trying to pull the positive aspects from each of those while diminishing the negative returns is ultimately going to be a recipe for success. And so with that, it would be great for people who are listening to kind of give them a starting off point of like, hey, okay, I learned all about these archetypes. Like maybe I have some idea of, what I'm resonating with from one or the other, positive or negative. But what would you recommend as like a practical use for this for the individual and how they can start?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say already from mentioning each one of these archetypes, you've already come into contact with the vibration of each of these types. And before kind of hopping into, well, what is my type? Like, how do I know if I am, for instance, perception? Well, first of all, I would recommend start with the three human energies, always. Start with, that's the easiest way. In my book, I go into detail, and in my workshops, I go into detail about how to start thinking about what am I dominant in. And once you identify the dominant one, then we usually identify the dormant. Okay, what am I weakest in next? And then
Mhm.
that naturally kind of that will find the secondary for you. And then from that gives what we call like the iconic type of like the type that kind of symbolizes the order of your three human energies. So I
Mhm.
usually say that's a really good way to start. And then from there, we start to go to the types. And then we identify your outer type is like the type that you embody the strongest. Like you naturally kind of orient yourself towards the most. Um, and then you can kind of go through the whole like composition, and then you do the same kind of process of starting with the weaker, and then that's a. But I think before even getting into that, there's a few guidelines that I would recommend in approaching applying the model, or like before even hopping into it. And I think the first is it's nice to think about this is like it's like trigonometry. It's like I'm giving you like the 3 points, or I'm giving you like a color scale, and it's just like a way to orient yourself. So the guidelines that I one of the important ones is, well, I'd say the first one is to verify yourself. Okay, so the spirit of self-verification is how we approach this. So the question is, how do I know it's true? Okay, maybe I feel a resonance towards a particular one, maybe another one I don't feel, but how do I know that it's actually true? The behaviorist would say, oh, we can like make a nice questionnaire and it'll perfectly define it for you. Or maybe the ancient models say, well, base it on your natal chart. The way that we approach it is we all have beliefs. We have really strong beliefs. And so when I come into contact with this model, naturally you're going to start to form a belief about what's one of the types of energies. Like, I believe I'm action dominant. And I believe that I might be stronger and leader. So in this way, talking about like the concept of being a psychologist, you start to formulate a theory of your own personality based on these like trigonometric points that I've given you, and then you form a belief on it, and then just test it and try it out and see if it works. Wear that identity, try it out, and see like if I operate assuming that I'm a scientist. For instance, when I started, I thought that I was a scientist.
Mhm.
It's like when I first like confronted, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I definitely reflection, but I think I'm a scientist. So I kind of wore that identity for a few weeks of like, let me try it out. Let me see how this works. I kind of like kind of thought of myself in that way and like trying to think through things in like this way. And then I started to realize like, no, that's not who I am. Like I don't enjoy, I don't like, I really love philosophical conversations. Like I love that. I don't see truth in this way. I see it more in this other way. So I tried out that belief and then I found it's not working for me. So we could say in this sense, what's true is it working for you?
Mhm.
Is it helping you get to where you want to go? And in the context of personal development, is it helping me develop in a way that I wanted to grow in, or in my relationships? So, for instance, at the time that I was learning this, I had a partner who was a painter, and I assumed, oh, she seems really strong artist type. She seems very strong. So I started kind of relating to her with this. this kind of idea of like, okay, let me test out. So you test it with yourself, with
Mhm.
your own self identity. And then I kind of formed the hypothesis of, I believe that she's a really strong artist. So let me try to adjust how I relate to her slightly with that kind of belief and see what happens. Right away, she instantly starts to tell me, oh my God, yes. Like, yeah, that's exactly how I feel. Oh my God. Like, communicate. I'm getting feedback of she feels like I'm understanding her on a way deeper level than before from using that. So, but the thing is that leads to the second guideline, which is listen, don't label. The number one problem with any of these kinds of personality types is that you start to label people as one thing and then not listening. The whole goal of using these language in general, we have to use language. We have to use language to understand people. It's what we do. But if you say, like if I just label someone as, oh, they're a manager, but then I'm not using that as a tool to listen deeper. Like the whole goal of this is to help us listen deeper to one another. Listen, try to identify what are they bringing? What light are they bringing? What is their gifts of their soul that they're bringing that I couldn't see before? It's helping me gain that sight of, wow, they're so amazing. And I couldn't appreciate that before without this kind of holistic context of seeing things. And also with yourself, it's not to be like, I'm a philosopher and like I rigidly identify with this one thing. Then you actually cut off listening to yourself and to your needs, because maybe that day you need to be more in an artist kind of perception space, and you need to listen to that side of yourself. But if you just identify, you label yourself in one way, you're no longer listening to what your needs are at that moment. um so yeah, that's a kind of general, a few guidelines and concepts to keep in mind when approaching the model. But I would say for yeah, so you want, like, are you curious more about like, okay, how can people actually identify their composition?
Yeah, or if people are interested in kind of, taking a deeper look at this, obviously reading your book is a really good place to start, but any other resources that you have, maybe some things on your site that people could go to and get a deeper understanding.
Yeah, definitely. I think a good kind of beginning tool, already intuitively, when people listen to this, they start to think, oh, I know a person who's just like that.
Mhm.
Oh my God, that person is just like, and like, oh my God, that's me. Like that definitely sounds like who I am. So you already start to feel these intuitions. But yeah, to really get a deeper understanding, I mean, I'm not just trying to flog myself, but you do have to like spend time learning it and build to have a better connection to it. Um, and the best way to do that is through workshops. But I do have free tool. Like I'd say a good place to start is you go to my website and I have a free personality assessment, and that's just a 15 question self-report questionnaire that you can fill in, and that can kind of help point you in the right direction. And I send an email template, so it gives you like an idea, like, oh, okay, I might be leaning towards this one. For those listening, don't take the type so seriously too. Like when I say it's an iconic type, it's just to help you get an idea of like the order of what your three human energies might be. But the only way to really develop a quick connection is, yes, you can purchase my book and read it. This is a really dense book. If I'm being honest with you, I don't recommend that most people read this. It's not going to be, they're not going to get the value out of it so much unless they experience it. It's just going to be mental. And these transformations are emotional. This is more than just mental, it's mental and emotional. And to do that, you have to relate to other people in real time. You can't just, books are great for mental transformation. You can, it's time independent. That's why we can read books thousands of years old and the consciousness of the author is still contained in it and be
Mhm.
transformed. But emotional, you have to relate to people in real time. Um, yeah, so I think my workshops are designed to really help people to not only get an idea of the concepts, but to practice it directly with people. And I kind of consider it's like, you've ever heard of the concept of like deep work?
Mhm.
Like this idea of like, for those who might not be familiar, like it's this idea of like, if I remove all distractions and I just focus on one mental task, with all my concentration, I can get the same amount of work done in 2 hours that I could if I did 8 hours where I was kind of distracted and talking to other people in a loud cafe. If I just honed in, I got way more done. So for me, I consider the workshops as like I've designed it so it's like, how can I, if I were to teach this as a university course, but like way more dynamic, with like actually learning through doing and experiencing, and I studied like the transformative workshops, how do the best people do it, and I've designed it so like people can really get the most out of the shortest amount of time. And so for the people who want to go further, that would be a great tool. And if you want to learn more about it, I also have an ebook, a free ebooklet on my website too, and you can just book a call with me. I'd be happy to have a conversation because I recognize it's not for everybody. At the end of the day, it's just a tool to help understand yourself. There's many other tools out there. There's plenty of other communication tools, and they're also compatible with each other. I'm not trying to say if you do this, say goodbye to nonviolent communication or human design forever. Like, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying this is a tool. I think it's really good. Nobody knows about this. No one knows about this at all yet.
Mm.
And part of why I've written the book and done this work, over 2 years of training and things like this, is because I feel the world needs to know about this. But not everyone is ready to take on that new opportunity. And yeah, but if someone who's watched this happens to be called, yeah, check out my website and I got resources there for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I would definitely recommend it because I've taken the quiz actually a few times as far as just like the brief questionnaire. And, obviously it's it's a lot more dynamic than that, but it is a good starting off point. And I know I took it maybe a week and a half ago, or 2 weeks in between time, and I got a different result, right? So it speaks to your point of like things are always changing and evolving, but this can be a good starting off point if you're just curious a little more about the types. Like, okay, let me answer these questions, see what I get back, and then reflect on that, what's resonating, what's not, and just kind of go from there. But I do think it's an interesting thing for people to at least just check out. And definitely if you're interested in learning more about the specific types, kind of a lot of what we talked about today, but in even more detail and depth, the ebook is a great place to start. And then obviously the book as well is amazing. So I think that's a good kind of point for us to wrap up, Jamal. I just want to say thanks again for coming on. If you want to just let people know where to find you, because I'm sure some folks are going to be interested to check out the site and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, thank you for having me on. It's been amazing to share this work. Um, yeah, if you want to contact me, go to my website, jamalmaroon.com. That's the best way. There you can book a call with me, send me an email, and that's the best way to. I'm not on social media. Like in terms of business, logically, I should be like pumping out contact or content and trying to contact everybody like cold call. That's not my style. I'm very confident that this is very valuable what I have to offer, and I like people to contact me, so that's the best way to do it. I do put up YouTube videos, so you can also check out my channel at Jamal Maroon on YouTube. But that's it for the social media. I have a newsletter too. If you're
Mhm.
interested in my other kinds of thoughts and reflections on psychology, practical spirituality in general, then you can check out the Maroon Papers. That's all on my website though.
Yeah, perfect. That definitely speaks to a little bit of your philosopher type. But hey, you're making the action a little longer, setting up the YouTube and everything. So good work on that.
Thank you. Yeah, well, it's been an honor, and I definitely plan to be back for
Oh
some
yeah.
more.
Yeah, definitely. We're definitely going to have you back on. There's so much to talk about. And I know, just to speak to it finally in the end here, like the lineage of where this teaching comes from, right? From Omraam is like that guy just does such a great job of distilling really complicated topics into a digestible format. And I think that's what was articulated today. So definitely looking forward to having you on in the future and kind of diving into some more aspects of those teachings outside of the personality model.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think this is a brilliant, and the personality model is an example of a seed taken from Omron,
Yep.
planted, cultivated over a long period of time, and this is what it's bared fruit into. So I mentioned that because I really believe that Omram has given so many seeds in his work. And for those of us who are interested and devoted to building a better world, for humanity. They're interested in intentional communities, in yoga, in health, holistic health, in all these areas. You can find seeds in his work and plant them. I am certain. Whatever it is that you feel called, your calling is, I think you can find something in there. I just so happen to feel a calling with a personality model, but yeah, that's definitely a topic I'd love to dive into more in the future.
Perfect. Well, I'll put the link to your website in the show notes. So if anyone wants to get in contact with Jamal, feel free there, or you can get in contact with me for any questions. But thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks again, Jamal, for coming on, and we'll see you guys next time. Peace.
Peace.